Films in Focus with David Sterritt is underwritten by The Movie House, your destination for first-run Hollywood and independent movies, and a digital portal to the Met Opera, National Theatre Live, and special events worldwide in Millerton, New York, and on the web, themoviehouse.net.
David Sterritt is the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, contributing writer at Cineast, film professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, Robin Hood Radio's very own critic. He joins us weekly. The films I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I See You, and 1BR. Hi, David. How did I do?
You did real well, Jill. That third movie, 1BR, that's as in one bedroom, but we'll get to that in a few moments. We'll start off in another part of the house. As I mentioned to you, I think just after we finished up last week, this week I wanted to talk about some horror films again. This is turning out to be, and I don't think it's because of the pandemic, because it takes a while to make a feature film, and these movies would have been in the pipeline probably before the pandemic hit. But for whatever reason, 2020 is turning into a very active year for horror movies, and to a certain extent a good year for horror movies. There have been a few good ones, and each one of the three I have to talk about today are, if you like horror movies, these are really movies to check out. And even if you're not crazy about horror movies, I'm Thinking of Ending Things is of interest for all sorts of reasons. So I just sort of recommend all three. The second two maybe especially for people who really like horror films, but I'm Thinking of Ending Things for them and beyond that too. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is based on a novel, first of all, by Ian Reid, and I have read this novel, and it's a very interesting novel. About half of it, maybe roughly, is about a young man and woman who recently got together as a couple, and they are driving off so that she can meet his parents for the first time, and then they get to the farm where the parents live, and various things happen, and the whole last part of the novel takes place in a school in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. And the thing about it is that throughout the story, things are just a little bit off. This is a little bit strange. This is a little bit peculiar. I can't quite figure out why this happened, thinks the young woman or the young man. And we gradually get this building atmosphere of sort of dread, and maybe something as horrible is going to happen. And there are also sort of flash forwards to this sort of dialogue that somebody is having, and we're not sure who it is, and it all becomes clear at the end. So anyway, it's a horror novel, and it's a pretty good one. It's a little bit derivative here and there on some of the Stephen King and that sort of thing, but it's a good novel, and I guess it's found a pretty active readership. Well, now that novel has been made into a movie by the extraordinary Charlie Kaufman, who both wrote this movie for the screen, the adaptation of the novel, and directed it. Now, Charlie Kaufman is still to this day probably best known for movies he made around the end of the novel of the 90s and the beginnings of the 2000s. Being John Malkovich is sort of the movie that really put him on the map in a big way. Adaptation, very, very interesting movie with Nicolas Cage. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And these movies were directed by others, by Spike Jonze and Michel Gondry. And then he, several years ago, I guess about a dozen years ago, he directed his own movie that he wrote, Synecdoche, New York, and then he co-directed an animated film that he wrote called Anomalisa. I mention all these movies because every one of them is really, really interesting. He does these strange sort of meta storytelling things where stories fold back in upon themselves, and there's all sorts of peculiar things going on. Some of these movies are extremely entertaining, thanks in part to their casts and to the other directors who direct them. Synecdoche, New York, I can't exactly call it entertaining, but it's an extraordinary act of imagination. I think there's no other movie that is really much like it. And that can go, except that it falls into the horror genre to some extent, for I'm Thinking of Ending Things. So as in the novel that it's based on, I'm Thinking of Ending Things begins with a long sequence about just two people in a car. And it's fascinating. It's absolutely riveting. At least I found it so. The people are played, by the way, by remarkable performers. Jesse Plemons plays the young man. Jessie Buckley plays the young woman. And they are on their way to visit his parents in the farm where they live, and they are played by David Thewlis and Toni Collette. And then we have a very strange scene in the farmhouse when they have dinner and they all get to know each other. And then we have a switch of scene to a school, and all sorts of peculiar things happen there too. Now, I have to say, the novel by Ian Reid, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, is unusual, unconventional in various ways. It ultimately turns out to be a very interesting sort of a psychological horror movie that all the pieces fit together in the end. The movie version, written and directed by Charlie Kaufman, is a lot stranger than the novel. So just to give you one example, when we're in the farmhouse, when the young couple are getting together with his parents, played again by David Thewlis and Toni Collette, he keeps changing his age. Sometimes the father is really old, and sometimes the father is pretty young. Sometimes he has gray hair, sometimes he has white hair, and it sort of switches back and forth. It's always changing. Sometimes the mother is this hale and hearty woman who is welcoming them and making everything nice, and other times she's a bedridden old person who can barely even stand up, and it goes back and forth. It's not like it goes from point A to point B. It's always oscillating. And that's the way the whole movie works. So you have to get into this movie on its own highly imaginative terms. Ultimately, it's about the things that Charlie Kaufman's movies tend to be about. It's about the uncertainty of what is real and what is not real. It's about the reality or unreality of things like aging and romantic relationships. And it's about how all these things fit together, in this case, in a movie which is ultimately a sort of a horror movie. Well, it's a real horror movie that has all of these uncertainties also built into it. I will also mention that there's a pretty long ballet sequence near the end, and we have a lot of references to the great Oklahoma, the great musical Oklahoma, which seems to be in the wind nowadays. So if you're interested in a good horror movie or in a really unconventional movie that really keeps you on your toes, I cannot recommend I'm Thinking of Ending Things highly enough. It's really one of the most interesting movies of the year, and so far certainly one of the very best movies of the year. Other two horror movies I want to talk about today are a little bit less conventional than that. The first one is called I See You. This was directed by Adam Randall. And it's just a really, really well-done horror movie, which has about 3 storylines that are all going on. They're very tightly connected with each other. They all involve the same characters. But one storyline that sort of runs through the movie is that there are some kidnappings taking place. A couple of teenagers have been kidnapped. Nobody knows by whom, and one of the main characters of the movie, who is actually a police officer named Greg, played by John Tenney, he is trying to crack the case and trying to find out what's been going on here and solve the kidnappings. And there are strong indications that these may be the work of somebody who abducted some kids many years earlier. And that is another sort of sub-storyline that features in the movie. But mainly, we have this one storyline which has to do with some kids have been kidnapped. Who did it? Can this young, not that young, middle-aged police officer crack the case? A second storyline that goes right along with this one is about that police officer and his wife, Jackie, who is played by Helen Hunt. She recently had an affair with another man, and it has sent their domestic harmony into a tailspin. He is very angry at her, and even angrier at her for her infidelity and her sort of messing things up is their teenage son, who is extremely upset, has been really thrown off base, off balance by his mother's having this affair. He's furious at her for what she has done to his father and to their family by this. So that's a second storyline, and again, it's the same police officer who is trying to solve the kidnappings, which are one storyline, who is now involved in this thing with not only his wife's infidelity, which is maybe over now or may not be over now. We find that out in the course of the movie, but also with their son being so absolutely furious about this. Then there's a third storyline, which is very, very major in the film, which has to do with something called frogging, which is spelled with a PH. Frogging turns out to be something that you do when you move into another person's house and live there in secret without letting them know that you're you're there, keeping it a secret, and having your fun while the family is out, and the rest of the time keeping your profile so low that they never guess that you are there. It's called frogging because the people who did this sort of jump from one house to another as they do this. It's partly a prank, and it's partly a way of just having a place to live, and it's partly just a way of being a smart alecky young person who's putting something over on some settled householders. And so we have, well into the movie, we have these two young people involved who are frogging. And they have moved into the house of the police officer and his wife and their son. Only they're in secret, and it's a pretty big house, so they're hiding out in a part of the house that is not too frequently visited. And then a conflict develops between these two froggers, who are a young man and a young woman. The young woman has done this before, and she knows that it's a serious business, and you have to really, really, really be careful not to get caught, not to get spotted, because you're doing all kinds of illegal things here. Whereas the young man who is along, and she's brought him along because he's going to document this with his camcorder, he is much more irresponsible and is always doing these extremely risky things that are maybe even to get them caught. So I'm going to recap here for just 1 second. We've got 3 different storylines, all of which involve the same family of Greg and Jackie and their son, Connor, played by Judah Lewis. One, we have the kidnappings, which the father is trying to solve as a police officer. Second, we have the tremendous tension between the husband and wife and their son because of her recent infidelity. And third, we have these other 2 young people who are secretly living in their house who are frogging. And that we only discover sort of well into the movie. And an interesting thing happens because well into the movie, the whole story of the movie, or maybe I should say stories, starts over again at the beginning from a different point of view. Now, all this, as I sometimes say when I'm talking about the plots of these movies, may sound complicated. It is as clear as a bell when you're watching the movie. And by the end of the film, you realize that even some strange things that didn't seem to fit really do fit. All the pieces just sort of come together. I like movies more for atmosphere and mood and psychology. I'm not so crazy about movies where you have to sort of piece together a lot of clues in your mind. And in this case, this is a movie where you do kind of have to do that, but I really enjoyed doing it. And I think it's just a movie that works very, very nicely. Again, it's a horror movie. It's a whodunit with various interwoven plot lines, and I just had a good time watching it. It's a good horror movie, a good suspense movie. I recommend it. I See You. Third movie, 1BR, as in one bedroom, what you might see in a classified ad, is another horror movie, in this case written and directed by a new filmmaker named David Marmor. And it stars Nicole Bryden Bloom as a young woman named Sarah who has just moved to Los Angeles, where she wants to start over again. She wants to have a new, maybe more successful life. She's a young woman. She's not very happy with the way her life has been going so far. She would like to get into show business. That's why she comes to Los Angeles, but it's not clear that she'll ever accomplish anything along those lines. But one of the first things she has to do is to find a place to live. So she sees this very nice apartment complex. This is Los Angeles. And so, this is outdoor space, indoor space. It's a 1-bedroom place. It's big enough for her. And she decides, I would like to apply to maybe get an apartment in this complex. And she's successful. She gets an apartment there. And then she moves in and she starts to get to know the other tenants. And they're the sorts of people who you might find in an apartment complex in Los Angeles. Some are older, some are younger, some seem very nice and outgoing, some seem sort of strange and hard to figure out. But little by little, in the first part of the movie, she starts to suspect that maybe this place is more peculiar than you would expect. Some of these people seem downright weird, and other ones who seem very nice, there are weird things about them. And little by little, it turns out that maybe they're not just weird, maybe there's something sinister going on here. So as we get into the movie, and I'm not sure exactly when this happens, and I'm not going to give any real spoilers here, but maybe about a quarter of the way into the movie, maybe about a third of the way into the movie, we discover that there's some really, really bad stuff going on in this apartment complex where poor Sarah has just rented her 1-bedroom place. And there are many, many people in this place who are into very, very weird stuff, and they're all in it together. This is sort of a group thing, and now she is in their clutches. And what is going to happen to her? And all kinds of, let's just say, all kinds of things happen, some of which are very sinister and some of which are pretty violent. There are times in 1BR when the violence steers almost to the extent, just maybe a couple of times in the movie, to what's sometimes called torture porn, where you're seeing violence which is obviously not real. We're dealing here with make-believe, it's special effects and all of that, but where the violence gets pretty nasty. It's what they sometimes call extreme violence. But that's only a couple of moments in the movie. For the most part, the movie is very much about psychological suspense and about a person becoming more and more aware that there are some really horrible things going on and that she is really trapped in the middle of those horrible things, and we start to wonder if she will ever be able to emerge intact. At the very, very end of the movie, there's one final twist which I found extremely effective. So again, this is another good horror movie. All three of these movies I'm talking about today are good, effective horror films. They all have their rough moments, especially 1BR in terms of violence, but they're just interesting, and they all held me riveted to the screen, and that's always a nice thing to be able to say about a movie. So that is my somewhat horrific story this week, Jill.
Horrifying. Thank you very much, David Sterritt. Films in Focus. The films. I'm thinking of ending things. I See You. And 1BR, which is apparently one bedroom.